There is a monster that hunts every single human being on the face of the earth. It is an invisible, untouchable, and completely unstoppable predator. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot bribe it. You cannot fight it with massive standing armies, and you cannot cure it with the most advanced modern medicine. It is the ultimate, undefeated, silent enemy of the biological universe. That monster is time. From the exact millisecond you are born, you are placed on an invisible conveyor belt that moves in only one terrifying direction.
The ancient Greeks had a specific, chilling name for this relentless forward momentum. They called it Chronos. Chronos is chronological time. It is the ticking of the clock on the wall. It is the turning of the earth on its axis. It is the physical embodiment of the second law of thermodynamics, the undeniable, inescapable law of entropy, which dictates that absolutely everything in the physical universe is slowly breaking down, losing energy, decaying, and marching inevitably toward death. In ancient Greek mythology, Chronos was not a gentle grandfather. He was a monstrous titan who literally, physically devoured his own children, because time eventually consumes absolutely everything it creates.
Because we are trapped in this linear, chronological prison, human beings have always been obsessed with the idea of escaping it. In 1895, H.G. Wells wrote his famous science fiction novel, The Time Machine, giving the modern world the fantastical, intoxicating idea that a person could build a mechanical device of brass and spinning crystal, pull a heavy iron lever, and shatter the barrier of time, traveling backward into the deep past or forward into the distant, unknown future. Today, time travel is the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar global entertainment industry, fueling Hollywood blockbusters, theoretical physics debates, and quantum mechanics. We look at time travel as a modern scientific fantasy, a product of the industrial and digital ages.
A neat trick of science fiction. But what if it isn't? What if the concept of temporal displacement, of beings stepping outside the normal flow of history, bypassing a decay of the clock, reversing entropy, and violently bending the fundamental rules of the space-time continuum, is not a modern invention at all? What if it is the hidden, terrifying, and deeply profound undercurrent of the most ancient, heavily scrutinized, and blood-stained text in human history? Today, we are going to embark on an epic, mind-bending, and truly chilling journey through the pages of the Bible. We are going to strip away the soft, sanitized Sunday school simplicity and read these ancient texts through the lens of physics, philosophy, and the terrifying realities of eternity.
We are going to explore the ultimate temporal anomaly, the infinite creator who lives entirely outside the dimension of time. We will investigate the men who completely bypassed the biological necessity of death, stepping off the timeline into the unknown. But we will also plunge into the absolute dark reality of what happens when the fabric of time is violently ripped apart or weaponized by the divine. We will witness the cosmic horror of eternal beings illegally descending into the chronological timeline to genetically corrupt humanity. We will explore how God used time itself as an instrument of mass execution in the desert. We will examine the sheer astronomical terror of the sun stopping in the sky, freezing the rotation of the earth just to prolong a bloody, screaming slaughter.
We will look at souls trapped in the biological suspended animation of the deep ocean, and the dark necromantic magic that ripped a sleeping soul out of eternity and dragged it screaming back into the present. We will analyze the severe psychological trauma of the prophets, whose fragile human minds were weaponized as temporal projectors, forcing them to experience the apocalyptic horrors of the future. And finally, we will witness the exact physical moment on a high mountain in the Middle East, where the past, the present, and the future violently, physically collided. To truly understand the anomalies of time in the biblical text, we first have to fundamentally, radically change how we view the author of the text. We have to look at the very nature of God.
When the average modern person thinks about God and time, they usually think of God as a being who just has a really, really long lifespan. We imagine God sitting on a golden throne in the clouds, watching history play out like a very long, high-definition movie. He saw the asteroid wipe out the dinosaurs. He saw the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. He sees us today, and he will eventually see the end of the world. In this view, he is just older than everything else. But in Orthodox Judeo-Christian theology, this view is completely, philosophically, and physically incorrect. God is not a being inside of time with an infinite lifespan. God is the grand architect who created time itself.
Time is a physical property of the universe, inextricably linked to space, matter, and gravity, as Albert Einstein brilliantly proved with his theory of general relativity. Before the physical universe existed, time literally did not exist. There was no before, because time had not yet been spoken into being. Therefore, the creator of the universe must exist entirely, utterly outside the dimensions of space and time. Theologians call this concept the eternal present. God does not experience the past, the present, and the future sequentially, one second after another. He experiences all of history, from the explosive, blinding light of the Big Bang to the final freezing heat death of the universe, simultaneously, in one single, blinding, eternal, all-encompassing now. C.S.
Lewis famously explained this reality using the analogy of a man writing a novel. The author of a book is not trapped inside the timeline of the story he is writing. If a character in Chapter 1 takes 10 years to walk across a continent to reach Chapter 2, the author does not have to sit at his desk and wait 10 years for the character to arrive. The author holds the entire book, all 300 pages, in his hands at once. He can look at page 1, page 50, and the final paragraph at the exact same moment. This profound, mind-bending reality is the key to unlocking the greatest mystery of the Hebrew Bible, the very name of God.
In the book of Exodus, chapter 3, Moses is standing in the scorching, desolate, sun-baked wilderness of Midian, staring at a bush that is burning with brilliant fire, but is miraculously not being consumed by the flames. Entropy is not applying to the wood. God commands Moses to go back to Egypt and demand the release of the enslaved Israelites from the most powerful man on earth, the Pharaoh. Moses, terrified and looking for an out, asks God a highly practical question. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" Then what shall I tell them? God answers with a phrase from the burning bush that completely shatters the boundaries of human language and logic. He does not give Moses a noun.
He gives him a verb. He says in ancient Hebrew, Eye asher eye, I am who I am. It is the ultimate, absolute declaration of temporal independence. God does not say I was, because he is not bound by the dusty histories of the past. He does not say I will be, because he is not waiting anxiously for the future to arrive. He is the absolute, self-existent, eternal present. He is the great I am. This is exactly why the Apostle Peter writes in his second epistle, "With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." Peter isn't just using pretty poetic language. He is making a definitive statement about divine, multidimensional physics. To an entity that exists entirely outside the dimension of time, chronological duration is utterly meaningless. A millisecond and a millennium hold the exact same weight. The entire timeline of human suffering, the rise and fall of massive empires, the building of pyramids, and the launching of rockets, it is all just a single, static brushstroke on a massive, eternal canvas. But what happens when this eternal, timeless dimension begins to bleed into our linear, chronological, decaying world? What happens when fragile human beings, who are biologically chained to the ticking clock of their own cellular death, suddenly encounter the timeless realm? We get the first great temporal anomaly of the Bible, the man who bypassed death entirely. His name was Enoch. If you open the book of Genesis, chapter 5,
you encounter what most people consider one of the most boring, repetitive sections of Scripture. It is a long, sweeping, monotonous genealogy connecting the first man, Adam, to Noah. The formula for the text is relentless, rhythmic, and terrifying in its repetition. It says, a man lived this many years, he had a son. He lived this many more years, and then he died. The phrase, and then he died, strikes like a heavy, monotonous iron bell tolling at the end of every single generation. It is the dark drumbeat of Chronos devouring humanity. Seth lived 912 years, and then he died. Enoch lived 905 years, and then he died. Canaan lived 910 years, and then he died. But then you reach the 7th generation from Adam.
A man named Enoch. The biblical text completely, jarringly, breaks the established formula. Genesis 5:24 says, Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. The heavy iron bell of death does not ring for Enoch. The phrase, and then he died, is conspicuously, miraculously missing. Enoch is simply walking upon the earth, living his life, and then, inexplicably, he vanishes from the chronological timeline. He is translated. He is relocated. He steps out of the stream of linear time and walks directly into the eternal present. The mystery of Enoch was so profound, so deeply unsettling, and so intellectually fascinating to the ancient world that it spawned an entire massive library of apocryphal and pseudepigraphal literature.
The most famous of these is the Book of Enoch. Although it is not included in the canonical Bible of most Western churches, the Book of Enoch was incredibly popular in the 1st century, and it was considered so authoritative by some that it was directly quoted by the Apostle Jude in the New Testament. In the Book of Enoch, we get a detailed, terrifying, and awe-inspiring account of what actually happened to this man after he vanished from the earth. According to the text, Enoch doesn't just disappear into the ether. His physical body and soul are taken on a massive, multi-dimensional cosmic journey. The angels lift him up into the heavens. He is shown the hidden storehouses of the wind, the deep foundational pillars of the earth, and the blazing, crystalline, terrifying throne of God.
But more importantly, Enoch becomes a literal time traveler. Because he is taken out of the physical universe and brought into the eternal realm, he is granted the terrifying, omniscient ability to see the entirety of human history simultaneously. The Book of Enoch contains a massive, heavily symbolic section called the Dream Visions, or the Animal Apocalypse. In this vision, Enoch, who was living long before the Great Flood, sees the entire future of the world play out before his eyes. He sees the coming flood that will wipe out humanity. He sees the exodus from Egypt. He sees the rise of the violent Babylonian and Greek empires. He sees the exact coming of the Messiah. Enoch is completely unmoored from the clock.
He becomes a cosmic watcher of history, standing on the high balcony of eternity, looking down at the entire bloody, tragic, beautiful parade of human existence, from its absolute beginning to its absolute end. But the era in which Enoch lived also reveals one of the darkest, most terrifying, and deeply disturbing temporal anomalies in the entire biblical record. It is a story of what happens when eternal beings unlawfully, maliciously invade the chronological timeline. In Genesis chapter 6, right before the catastrophic, world-ending flood, the biblical text describes a chilling, almost Lovecraftian event. It says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose."
The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. The sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim in Hebrew, were not human beings. In ancient Hebrew cosmology, they were angelic beings. They were members of the divine spiritual council who lived in the eternal, timeless realm. But according to this dark text, and expanded upon heavily in the Book of Enoch, these eternal beings committed the ultimate, unforgivable cosmic crime. They looked down at the physical, time-bound, decaying dimension of Earth, and they descended. They took physical bodies. They stepped out of eternity and violently forced their way onto the human timeline. This is the dark, horrific reality of a temporal invasion.
By leaving eternity and mating with human women, these fallen angels introduced corrupted, monstrous, eternal DNA into the human timeline. They gave birth to the Nephilim, eternal knowledge into the timeline long before humanity was spiritually or culturally ready to handle it. They taught humans how to forge iron swords, how to create deceptive cosmetics, how to mix poisons, and how to practice dark, manipulating sorcery. They artificially accelerated human history, plunging the world into an apocalyptic nightmare of violence, bloodshed, and technological warfare. Time had been fundamentally hacked.
The biological clock of humanity was polluted by immortal intruders. This temporal and genetic corruption was considered so absolute, so irreversibly toxic to the future of the planet, that God had to respond with overwhelming, unmitigated force. And his first act of judgment was not the flood. His first act of judgment was to weaponize time itself against the human race. Before this invasion, the human beings listed in the genealogies were living for incredibly vast stretches of time. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. They possessed a near immortality, a slow, drawn-out chronological clock.
But when humanity became entirely corrupted by violence and the influence of the Watchers, a terrifying reality set in. If a human being is inherently evil, and that human being lives for 900 years, the amount of torture, tyranny, and devastation they can inflict upon the world is catastrophic. Immortality in the hands of a monster is the ultimate nightmare. So, in Genesis 6:3, God looks at the broken, bleeding world and declares, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. This is one of the most chilling acts of divine judgment in the Bible. God steps into the biological machinery of the human genome, and he literally, physically, edits the human clock. He amputates their timeline. He slashes their lifespan by nearly 90%. He installs a hard, unavoidable expiration date on human existence. Time, which had once been a vast, open expanse, is suddenly weaponized as a form of biological quarantine. The decay of the body, the wrinkling of the skin, the eventual stopping of the heart, these became the divine safeguard to ensure that no tyrant, no warlord, and no human monster could ever rule the earth forever. God used the relentless march of Chronos to limit the capacity of human evil. But what happens when human beings refuse to accept the timeline God has decreed? What happens when a human being tries to desperately cling to a past that has already been slated for destruction? We find the terrifying answer in the book of Genesis, chapter 19.
The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The cities of the plain have become entirely consumed by violence, arrogance, and horrific abuse. God has decreed that their timeline is over. Their existence is going to be deleted from the earth via an apocalyptic rain of fire and burning sulfur. But God, in his mercy, sends 2 angels to physically drag a man named Lot and his family out of the city before the fire falls. As the angels are rushing them out into the darkness, they give Lot and his family a strict, absolute, non-negotiable temporal command. Flee for your lives. Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Looking back was not just a minor physical infraction. In the deeply symbolic theological reality of this moment, looking back was a temporal sin.
It was the act of yearning for a timeline, a life, and a past that God had already condemned. It was a refusal to move forward into the future God was providing. As the sky explodes and the searing, blinding rain of fire annihilates the cities, Lot's wife disobeys the command. She stops. She turns around. She looks back at the burning past. And her judgment is absolutely horrific. She is not struck by lightning. She is not burned by the fire. The text simply says,
She became a pillar of salt. She is literally, physically frozen in time. She is transmuted from a living, breathing biological organism into a cold, dead geological anomaly. Salt is a preservative. It prevents decay.
In a terrifying, ironic twist of cosmic justice, because she refused to let go of the past, she was permanently, perfectly preserved in it. She was locked in a geological stasis, forever trapped in the exact millisecond of her hesitation, her face permanently turned toward a dead city. She became a blinding white monument to the absolute terror of refusing to move forward with the timeline. But petrification is a quick death. Sometimes God uses time not as a quick judgment, but as a slow, agonizing psychological prison. Fast forward to the Book of Numbers. The Israelites have been miraculously freed from slavery in Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea. They have journeyed to the very edge of the Promised Land, a place called Kadesh Barnea.
They send 12 spies into the land to scout it out. When the spies return, 10 of them deliver a terrifying, panic-inducing report. They say the land is beautiful, but it is filled with towering, bloodthirsty giants, the descendants of the Anakim, the remnants of the Nephilim. The people are completely paralyzed by fear. They weep all night. They declare that they would rather go back and die as slaves in Egypt than face the giants in the future. They completely reject the timeline God has prepared for them. God's response is not to instantly strike the 2 million people dead with a plague. His response is far darker and far more agonizing. He sentences them to time.
God tells them, "For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you." God places the entire nation of Israel on a massive geographical treadmill. He sentences them to wander in circles in the scorching, barren, lethal desert of the Sinai Peninsula for 4 decades. Why exactly 40 years? It was not an arbitrary number. It was the precise amount of chronological time required to ensure that every single adult over the age of 20 who had voted in fear would naturally age, wither, and die in the dust. Time became their executioner. They were forced to live in a terrifying liminal space, a chronological waiting room of death. Every day for 40 years, they had to wake up in the blazing heat, pack up their tents, walk in circles, and dig graves for their friends, their spouses, and their siblings. They were forced to watch their own slow biological decay, knowing absolutely that they would never see the end of the journey, until an entirely new, uncorrupted generation could grow up to take their place. Time was weaponized as a slow, grinding millstone of justice. But the dark reality of time manipulation in the Bible is not just about God using time as a punishment. It is also about the terrifying moments when God decides to physically break the mechanical laws of physics to achieve a human military objective. Look at the book of Joshua, chapter 10.
The Israelites, now led by Joshua, have entered the Promised Land and are engaged in a massive, brutal, all-out military campaign against a heavy coalition of 5 Amorite kings. The battle is raging across the rocky terrain at Gibeon. The Israelites are winning, slaughtering their enemies with swords and driving them down the steep, treacherous descent of Beth Horon. God even directly intervenes by hurling massive, lethal, crushing hailstones from the sky, killing more Amorites with ice than the Israelites are killing with iron. But Joshua realizes he has a massive tactical problem. The sun is beginning to set. In the ancient world, armies could not fight in the pitch black of night.
If the sun went down, the surviving Amorite armies would use the darkness to escape into the hills, regroup in their heavily fortified walled cities, and the war would drag on for agonizing years, costing thousands of Israelite lives. Joshua desperately needs more time. He needs more hours on the clock to finish the eradication of his enemies. So, in an act of staggering, unprecedented, almost insane audacity, Joshua stands in front of the entire bleeding, exhausted army, looks up at the sky, and issues a direct, physical command to the cosmos. He shouts, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon." And then, the biblical text records an event that completely, utterly shatters the fundamental laws of astrophysics.
So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped.
till the nation avenged itself on its enemies. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. Imagine the sheer, absolute physical terror of that moment. To make the sun appear to stand still in the sky, from a modern astronomical perspective, means that the creator of the universe literally had to hit the brakes on the rotation of the Earth. A massive, rocky planet spinning at roughly 1,000 miles per hour at the equator was brought to a grinding, impossible halt, without the conservation of momentum ripping the crust of the Earth apart, throwing the oceans out of their beds, or causing apocalyptic, extinction-level global tsunamis. The laws of inertia were simply deleted for 24 hours.
But look past the awe of the physics and focus on the dark, chilling reality of why time was frozen. Time was not stopped so two lovers could embrace longer in a romantic meadow. Time was not stopped so a poet could admire a beautiful, lingering sunset. The rotation of the Earth was violently arrested. The mechanical clock of the universe was shattered, specifically to prolong a screaming, blood-soaked massacre. The blazing sun hung glaring and motionless in the sky, baking the hot blood into the dirt of the battlefield, simply to afford Joshua enough daylight to systematically hunt down, corner, and execute thousands of terrified, retreating men.
The biblical author notes with a sense of profound awe and quiet terror, "There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being." It is the ultimate display of temporal manipulation, weaponized for sheer, unmitigated warfare. Yet, as terrifying as it is to forcefully stop the clock, it is even more mind-bending to force the clock to run backward. We see this exact anomaly centuries later in the book of Isaiah, chapter 38. King Hezekiah of Judah is violently, terminally ill. He has a massive, infected boil that is going to kill him. The great prophet Isaiah walks into his royal bedchambers and delivers a cold, absolute death sentence directly from God. "Put your house in order, because you are going to die. You will not recover."
Hezekiah is devastated. He is in the prime of his life. He turns his face to the cold stone wall and weeps bitterly, begging God for more time. He is literally begging for an extension on his biological, decaying clock. God hears his desperate weeping, changes his mind, and sends Isaiah back to the king to tell him that God is going to add exactly 15 years to Hezekiah's timeline. But Hezekiah, struggling to believe such a massive, impossible reversal of medical fate, asks for a physical sign to prove it. God responds by offering to manipulate the very shadow of time itself. Outside the palace was the magnificent stairway of Ahaz, which functioned as a massive royal sundial, tracking the passage of the hours as the shadow slowly descended the steps.
God tells Isaiah, "I will make the shadow cast by the sun go back the 10 steps it has gone down on the stairway of Ahaz." The text records, "So the sunlight went back the 10 steps it had gone down." To achieve this, the rotation of the Earth didn't just stop, it briefly reversed. Entropy was undone. The fundamental arrow of time, which in our universe only points forward into decay and disorder, was grabbed by the invisible hand of the architect and forced violently backward. The light retreated. The past 15 minutes were physically undone and rewritten, serving as a cosmic physical guarantee that Hezekiah's biological cellular decay would also be pushed backward by 15 years. Time retreated to grant a man a longer life. But sometimes, a man doesn't want a longer life.
Sometimes a man wants time to stop completely so he can escape his calling. This brings us to the terrifying, claustrophobic anomaly of the prophet Jonah. God commands Jonah to go to the massive, wicked, brutal Assyrian city of Nineveh to preach repentance. Jonah, who deeply hates the Assyrians because of their legendary cruelty to the Israelites, flatly refuses. He wants Nineveh to burn. So Jonah runs in the exact opposite direction. He boards a ship heading to Tarshish, desperately trying to put geographical and chronological distance between himself and the voice of God. God responds by sending a terrifying, violent storm that threatens to rip the ship into splinters.
The pagan sailors, realizing Jonah is the cause of the divine wrath, throw him overboard into the raging, black, frothing Mediterranean Sea. Jonah sinks into the abyss. He is drowning. His timeline is about to end. But the text says, "Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." This is not a cute children's story about a man camping in a whale. This is a story of biological suspended animation. It is a story of a living nightmare. Imagine the absolute suffocating sensory deprivation of Jonah's reality. He is trapped inside the pitch-black, cramped, muscular stomach of a massive sea creature. He is surrounded by churning stomach acid, half-digested fish, and crushing oceanic pressure.
Seaweed is wrapped around his head. He has no idea if it is day or night. The ticking of the clock has been entirely erased by the darkness. In Jonah chapter 2, he prays a terrifying poem from the darkness. He says, "From deep in the realm of the dead, Sheol, I called for help. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever." Jonah experiences a literal biological purgatory. He is trapped in the belly of Sheol, the ancient Hebrew concept of the underworld. For 3 days and 3 nights, he is completely removed from the chronological flow of human events. Time has stopped for him.
He is experiencing a living death, hitting pause on a rebellious prophet's timeline until his arrogance is broken and he finally submits to the will of the Creator. God uses the belly of the beast as a temporal timeout, suspending a man between life and death until he is ready to re-enter the timeline and do his job. But if manipulating the sun, reversing entropy, and suspending life in the ocean is terrifying, there is a far darker, far more dangerous temporal anomaly in the Bible. What happens when human beings attempt to hack the eternal timeline themselves? What happens when we refuse to accept the silence of the future, and we try to drag the dead out of eternity and back into the ticking clock of the present? This brings us to the chilling, horrific, and deeply taboo narrative of the Witch of Endor. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 28, King Saul of Israel is in a state of absolute paralyzing panic. The massive, heavily armed, terrifying Philistine army has gathered against him for war. Saul looks at the enemy camp and his heart fills with dread. He is terrified, and when he prays to God for a military strategy or a promise of victory, he gets absolutely nothing. God is completely silent. No dreams, no visions from prophets, no answers from the Urim and Thummim. The heavens are shut. Saul is desperate. He needs information from the future, and since the Creator of time won't answer him, Saul decides to seek out the dead.
He strips off his royal robes, disguises himself in the middle of the pitch-black night, and sneaks behind enemy lines with 2 of his men to a village called Endor to find a necromancer, a woman who acts as a medium for the dead. Necromancy was strictly, brutally outlawed by the Torah, punishable by death, absolutely forbidden from opening. Saul pays the witch and demands that she bring up the spirit of the great prophet Samuel, who had died years earlier and was buried in Ramah. The witch begins her dark, illegal ritual. She expects to put on a show, to fake a voice, or to summon a familiar demonic spirit.
But suddenly, something goes horribly, unexpectedly, genuinely right. She actually sees the real, authentic spirit of Samuel rising up out of the earth, coming from Sheol, the ancient realm of the dead. The witch is so terrified by the sheer, overwhelming, authentic spiritual power of the entity she has summoned that she screams at the top of her lungs, suddenly realizing that the man standing in front of her in disguise is the king of Israel himself, the man who had previously executed all the mediums in the land. Saul calms her and asks what she sees. She replies, "I see a godlike being coming up out of the earth, an old man wearing a robe." But look closely at what Samuel says when his soul is dragged forcefully across the veil of death.
He doesn't offer comforting words to the king. He doesn't say he is happy to be back in the land of the living. Samuel looks at Saul, and his first words are a furious, agonizing, deeply irritated complaint. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" This is the profound, dark reality of pulling a soul out of eternity. Samuel was at rest. He was existing in the timeless, silent, peaceful realm of the dead, entirely free from the crushing gravity, the anxiety, and the wars of the chronological world. By using dark magic to rip his soul out of eternity and shove his consciousness violently back into the linear, war-torn, desperate timeline of the present, Saul had committed an act of severe spiritual violence.
He had disturbed the profound peace of the dead simply to satisfy his own selfish, pathetic panic about the future. Samuel, enraged at being disturbed, delivers a terrifying, absolute prophecy of doom. He tells Saul that not only has the Lord torn the kingdom away from him and handed it to David, and not only is the Lord going to hand the Israelite army over to the Philistines to be slaughtered, but he gives Saul an exact, unavoidable, chilling expiration date on his own timeline. "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Saul tried to hack time to save his life. He tried to peek behind the curtain of the future, and instead, the ghost he summoned simply handed him a 24-hour death warrant.
Saul is so utterly destroyed by the weight of this temporal knowledge that he collapses his full length into the dirt, completely paralyzed by terror, his strength entirely gone. This localized teleportation of a soul from eternity is terrifying, but it pales in comparison to the massive, physical, spatial temporal anomalies experienced by the prophets. When we hear the word prophet, we often think of a wise, bearded man standing on a street corner predicting the stock market, or giving vague, comforting warnings about being good people. But in the biblical reality, being a prophet was a brutal, physically violating, and deeply traumatizing experience.
A prophet was a fragile human being whose physical body and psychological consciousness were suddenly hijacked by the infinite Spirit of God and forced violently outside the normal, safe boundaries of space and time. Take the prophet Ezekiel. In the 6th century BCE, Ezekiel is living as a captive, sitting in his small mud brick house among the Jewish exiles by the Kebar River in the heart of Babylon. He is hundreds of miles away from the city of Jerusalem. In Ezekiel chapter 8, he records an event that sounds like a violent supernatural abduction. While he is sitting with the elders of Judah, a terrifying, glowing entity made of fire and gleaming metal appears in his living room. Ezekiel writes, "He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God he took me to Jerusalem." Ezekiel is physically and spiritually snatched from his geographical location. The rules of spatial distance instantly collapse. He is suspended in a terrifying, liminal, multidimensional space between earth and heaven, and instantaneously transported hundreds of miles through the air to the temple in Jerusalem, where he is forced to watch the secret, horrific, disgusting idolatry being practiced by the Jewish priests in the dark inner rooms of the sanctuary. But Ezekiel's journey through time and space gets even darker and even more impossibly magnificent in chapter 37, where he experiences the ultimate vision of reversed entropy, the Valley of Dry Bones. The Spirit of the Lord carries Ezekiel into the middle of a massive, desolate valley filled entirely with human skeletons. These bones are very dry, meaning these people have been dead for decades. They are the victims of a massive slaughter, their flesh entirely consumed by time, weather, and scavengers. They are bleached white by the sun. They are the ultimate, final, undisputed product of Chronos. God asks Ezekiel a question that defies all biological logic. "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel, terrified of presuming the limits of divine physics, simply answers, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." God commands Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, and as he speaks the words of God, the timeline of decay goes in violent, terrifying, explosive reverse. Ezekiel hears a deafening, echoing, rattling noise sweeping across the valley.
He watches in absolute shock as millions of disconnected, scattered, bleached bones suddenly drag themselves across the dirt, seeking each other out, reassembling into perfect, structurally sound human skeletons. Then, defying every known law of biology and decomposition, thick white tendons magically appear and wrap tightly around the joints. Heavy muscle tissue and wet flesh violently materialize out of thin air and cover the bones, and warm skin grows over the muscles. Finally, the winds from the four corners of the earth rush into the valley like a hurricane, filling their lungs with breath. A massive, countless, breathing army of resurrected humans stands on their feet.
This vision is not just a beautiful metaphor for the future political restoration of the nation of Israel. It is a terrifying, awe-inspiring preview of the absolute, uncontested dominion the Creator possesses over time itself. Time is an arrow that breaks biological tissue down into dust. In the Valley of Dry Bones, God grabs the arrow, spins it around, and turns dust back into breathing, sweating, living tissue in a matter of seconds. It is the ultimate, mocking defeat of the clock. But what is the psychological toll of experiencing these timeline breaches? What happens to a human brain when it is forced to process the fourth dimension? For the prophets, seeing the future was not a gift. It was a curse. It was an agonizing, heavy, suffocating burden. When your fragile human consciousness is dragged centuries into the future, and you are forced to witness the apocalyptic destruction of your own city, the horrific slaughter of your people, and the burning of your sacred temple, you have to return to the present and carry the crushing weight of that grief while everyone around you is living in blissful, ignorant happiness. This is the Cassandra complex of the biblical prophets. They are time travelers who return to the present with absolute, undeniable knowledge of a coming nightmare, and absolutely nobody believes them. Look at the prophet Daniel. In the 6th century BCE, Daniel is living as a high-ranking exile in the opulent royal court of Babylon.
One night, he has a series of visions that are so intense, so vivid, and so utterly traumatizing that he physically collapses and suffers a massive neurological breakdown. In Daniel chapter 8, his mind is violently breached by the future. He sees a vision of terrifying, mutated beasts rising out of the churning sea. A lion with eagle's wings, a ravenous bear with ribs crushed in its mouth, a four-headed leopard with bird wings, and a terrifying, indescribable beast with iron teeth that crushes everything in its path. These were not just colorful metaphors. They were exact, precise, chronological previews of the rise and fall of the next four massive global superpowers: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece under the lightning-fast conquests of Alexander the Great, and the unstoppable, crushing, brutal iron war machine of the Roman Empire. Daniel is standing in Babylon, watching the armies of Greece and Rome march across the globe, slaughtering millions, hundreds of years before those empires even exist. The psychological shock of this temporal displacement completely shatters his nervous system. Daniel writes at the end of the chapter, "I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding."
He saw the violent, apocalyptic end of the world. And then he had to wake up the next morning, put his clothes on, go to the palace, and work as a bureaucrat in the Babylonian government, carrying the blood-soaked nightmare of the future locked inside his mind, unable to explain it to anyone. This brings us to a terrifying philosophical reality about how the ancient Israelites viewed the timeline. In the modern world, we generally view the future as a place of progress. We look forward to the future because we believe it will bring better technology, more peace, and higher living standards. But in the ancient biblical worldview, the future was not inherently safe. The people of Israel constantly prayed for something called the Day of the Lord.
They believed that on this specific future day on the timeline, God would finally intervene, destroy all their political enemies, make Israel the greatest superpower on earth, and establish a golden age of peace. They wanted the future to hurry up and arrive. They wanted to accelerate the clock. But the prophet Amos stepped into the public square and delivered a message that completely shattered their comfortable, optimistic view of the timeline. Amos looked at the corrupt, wealthy, hypocritical society of Israel, and he roared,
Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? That day will be darkness, not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear, as though he entered his house and rested his hand on the wall only to have a snake bite him. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness, not light, pitch dark without a ray of brightness? Amos was revealing a terrifying truth about the timeline. The timeline is rigged with justice. If you are living a life of corruption, cruelty, and selfishness, the future is not your friend. The future is an ambush. Amos is telling them that they are rushing headlong toward a brick wall of cosmic justice, and they don't even realize it. The dark reality of biblical time is that humanity is accelerating toward a final accounting, and for those who love oppression, the end of the timeline is an absolute nightmare.
But human prophets are not the only beings in the biblical narrative who are hyper-aware of the timeline and the impending brick wall of justice. There is another category of entities that possesses a terrifying, agonizing understanding of time, and it drives them to absolute, screaming madness: the demons. If we move into the New Testament, we find that the fallen angels, the demonic spirits that possess and torture human beings, are entirely, obsessively focused on the clock. Because they are eternal beings who rebelled against God in the deep past, they know with absolute certainty that a final apocalyptic judgment has been decreed against them, and they know exactly how much time they have left.
In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee into the Gentile region of the Gadarenes. He is immediately confronted by two men who are so violently, horrifically possessed by a legion of demons that they live in the graveyard tombs, howling at the moon, cutting themselves with stones, and breaking heavy iron chains. They are so dangerous and erratic that no one in the region can pass that way. When the demons inside the men see Jesus walking up the beach, they don't attack him. They don't try to fight him. They recognize him instantly as the eternal Son of God, the architect of the timeline, the one who holds the keys to the abyss, and they fall to the ground and scream a question that reveals the dark, pathetic, terrifying reality of their existence.
They shout, "What do you want with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" Listen to the absolute whimpering terror in that single sentence, "before the appointed time." Hell operates on a strict, unyielding chronological countdown. The demons are not afraid of fighting Jesus. They know they cannot win. What terrifies them to their core is the fear that God might suddenly change the timeline. They know there is a specific appointed day at the end of human history when they will be stripped of their power and thrown into the eternal, burning abyss. They are constantly watching the calendar.
When Jesus shows up early, unexpectedly walking into their territory, they panic, terrified that he has decided to advance the schedule, break the rules of the timeline, and execute their eternal judgment prematurely. The dark reality of the demonic realm is that it is a kingdom defined by absolute, impending chronological doom. They are prisoners waiting on death row, frantically watching the clock burn down, knowing they have absolutely no hope of a pardon. As we follow the ministry of Jesus and the subsequent birth of the early church, the anomalies of space and time become even more frequent, explosive, and bizarre. In the book of Acts, chapter 8, we find the first clear, undeniable, explicit account of human teleportation.
An early Christian evangelist named Philip is commanded by an angel of the Lord to walk down a desolate, scorching desert road going from Jerusalem south toward Gaza. There, he meets a vastly wealthy, powerful Ethiopian eunuch, the chief treasurer of the Queen of Ethiopia, sitting in his royal chariot, struggling to read and understand the ancient scroll of Isaiah. Philip climbs into the chariot, explains the prophecy of the suffering servant, reveals that Jesus is the promised Messiah, and the Ethiopian immediately demands to be baptized. They stop the chariot, go down into a body of water by the side of the desert road, and Philip baptizes the man. But look at what happens the exact millisecond they step out of the water.
Acts 8:39 records, "When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing."
Philip, however, appeared at Azotus. Philip doesn't walk away down the road. He doesn't say goodbye. He doesn't pack a bag. The physical, biological atoms of his body are instantaneously disassembled by the Holy Spirit, pulled completely out of the spatial temporal dimension, and violently reassembled at Azotus, a coastal city nearly 30 miles away. The fabric of physical geography was folded like a piece of paper, so an evangelist could bypass a 30-mile hike in the desert heat. Space and time yielded instantly to the mission of the gospel. And if Philip breached the rules of geographical space, the Apostle Paul breached the ultimate, terrifying rules of eternity. In his second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, Paul tries to explain an experience so profoundly terrifying, alien, and overwhelmingly magnificent that human vocabulary completely and utterly fails him. He writes, "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell." Paul is writing about himself in the third person, likely because the experience was too overwhelming, too holy to claim directly and proudly. He was violently pulled out of the chronological timeline and dragged upward into the third heaven, the absolute eternal command center of the universe where God resides. Notice his massive, repeating psychological confusion. Was I in my physical body? Was I just a soul? I don't know. The physics of the experience completely broke his mind's ability to categorize reality. And what did he hear while he was standing outside of time? He heard things that are inexpressible, things that are literally illegal, forbidden by cosmic law, for a human being trapped on the chronological timeline to utter out loud. Paul had to return from the eternal present. He had to step back into his decaying, aging, heavily scarred and frequently beaten physical body, and spend the rest of his life making tents, enduring shipwrecks, and suffering in cold Roman prisons, knowing exactly what was waiting behind the curtain of time. It is an unimaginably heavy psychological burden to walk the dusty earth when you have already breathed the air of paradise and heard the unfiltered voice of the eternal. But all of these events, Philip teleporting, Paul visiting the third heaven, Enoch vanishing into the sky, Ezekiel reversing the entropy of bones, and Joshua freezing the sun in the middle of a slaughter, are merely isolated, localized glitches in the matrix compared to the central, explosive, universe-altering collisions of time that surround Jesus of Nazareth. This brings us to the most spectacular, bizarre, and undeniable moment of temporal collision in the entire Bible. It is a moment where the veil between the deep past, the gritty present, and eternal glory is violently ripped completely open. It is the Transfiguration. If you open the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 17, Jesus takes his three closest friends, Peter, James, and John, and leads them up to the summit of a high, terrifyingly remote mountain. Many scholars believe it was Mount Hermon, a massive, imposing, snow-capped peak in the far north of Israel. The disciples are exhausted from the grueling climb, but as they reach the summit, the physical reality of Jesus begins to fracture. The text says he was transfigured before them. The Greek word used is metamorphothe. His fundamental form, his very essence, was altered. His face suddenly begins to shine with the blinding intensity of the sun, and his coarse, dusty clothes become as white and blinding as pure, unadulterated light.
For a brief, terrifying moment, the infinite, uncreated glory of God that was hidden inside his biological human body bursts through the fragile seams of his flesh. But Jesus is not alone on the mountain. Suddenly, two men step out of the blinding light and stand next to him. The disciples, trembling in absolute, face-melting terror, somehow instantly recognize who these men are. It is Moses, and it is Elijah. Let us stop and comprehend the sheer, staggering, temporal impossibility of this exact moment. Jesus is a man living in the 1st century CE. Moses is a man who lived, led the Exodus out of Egypt, and died on Mount Nebo 1,500 years earlier. Elijah is the wild, fiery prophet who was sucked into the sky in a terrifying whirlwind 900 years earlier.
And right here, on a cold, rocky peak in the Middle East, three distinct timelines have violently, physically collided. The past has physically manifested in the present. Moses, whose bones had turned to dust 15 centuries prior, and Elijah, who had bypassed death entirely, are standing on the dirt, fully conscious, physically present, having a conversation with Jesus of Nazareth. Why these two specific men? Why Moses and Elijah? Theologically, they represent the absolute foundational pillars of the Hebrew Bible. Moses represents the law given at Sinai. Elijah represents all the prophets. The entire foundation of the Jewish faith, the sum total of Israel's history, has traveled across the centuries to stand on this mountain and bear witness to the Messiah.
But look at what they are talking about. The Gospel of Luke gives us the specific, fascinating, and deeply moving detail of their conversation. Luke 9:31 says, "They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem." The Greek word used for departure in that sentence is exodus. They are talking about his exodus. 1,500 years earlier, Moses had led the physical exodus, freeing the slaves from the brutal tyranny of Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, Moses has traveled across time to stand on a mountain and discuss the ultimate cosmic exodus with Jesus, the exodus that Jesus is about to achieve in Jerusalem by bleeding to death on a Roman cross, an act that will definitively free all of humanity from the eternal tyranny of sin and death.
The first emancipator is handing the baton to the final emancipator. Peter, terrified, confused, and utterly overwhelmed by the majesty of the temporal collision, says something incredibly foolish. He says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter wants to build tents. He wants to capture the moment. He wants to build a shrine to hold the past and the present together permanently. He wants to trap eternity inside a canvas hut so he never has to go back down the mountain. But while he is still speaking, a bright, terrifying cloud covers them, and a booming voice from the cloud speaks with the authority of the cosmos. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him."
The disciples fall face down to the ground, terrified, expecting to be consumed. When they finally dare to look up, the cloud is gone. The blinding light is gone. Moses is gone. Elijah has returned to eternity. The timelines have uncoupled, snapping back into their proper places. Only Jesus is left, looking like a normal, dusty, tired carpenter again. The Transfiguration proves that in the biblical worldview, time is incredibly thin. It is not a solid, impenetrable wall of iron. It is a thin, fragile curtain. And when the creator of time decides to pull the curtain back, a prophet who has been dead for 1,000 years can step onto a mountain, have a conversation about the crucifixion, and step back out again without breaking a sweat.
But the ultimate, supreme time travel event in the Bible is not a human being stepping out of time into eternity. It is not a prophet seeing the future. It is eternity stepping down into time. It is the Incarnation. To understand the sheer, mind-bending philosophical weight of the Incarnation, you have to go back to the Gospel of John. John doesn't start his Gospel with a manger or shepherds or a dusty genealogy. He starts in the eternal present, long before the physical universe existed. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. The Word, the Logos, is the second person of the Trinity.
He is the divine architect of the cosmos. He is the author of space, gravity, light, and time. He exists outside the timeline, holding the entire expanding universe in the palm of his hand. And then, John writes the most staggering, scandalous, and physically impossible sentence in human history. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us.
The author of the book wrote himself into the story. The architect of time localized himself inside the prison of the clock. Imagine the sheer, terrifying claustrophobia of the Incarnation. The infinite God who holds the expanding galaxies and the burning stars voluntarily condenses his essence into a microscopic, single-cell human zygote in the dark, warm fluid of a teenage girl's womb.
The God who does not age suddenly subjects himself to the tyranny of Chronos. He experiences the slow, frustrating, agonizing passage of seconds, minutes, and years. He has to wait for his fingernails to grow. He has to wait for the sun to rise. He has to learn how to walk, stumbling and falling in the dust, bound by the very gravity he invented. The creator of the oceans has to ask a woman at a well for a drink of water because he is thirsty. This collision of eternity and time creates massive, almost incomprehensible paradoxes throughout the life of Jesus. He is constantly saying things that completely shatter the laws of linear logic. The greatest example of this happens in the Gospel of John, chapter 8.
Jesus is engaged in a furious, incredibly hostile, high-stakes debate with the religious elite in the temple courts of Jerusalem. The Pharisees are demanding to know who he thinks he is. They ask him if he thinks he is greater than their ancient, revered father Abraham, who had been dead for 2,000 years. Jesus looks at them and says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad." The Pharisees are utterly baffled by the math. They say to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham?" They are thinking linearly. They are looking at a man who was born 30-something years ago in Bethlehem, a man who has calluses on his hands and dirt on his feet.
To them, the idea that this young, radical carpenter could have possibly met a patriarch who lived in the Bronze Age is absolute, laughable, blasphemous insanity. But Jesus is not bound by their timeline. He looks at the furious crowd and delivers a sentence that is grammatically impossible, historically scandalous, and theologically absolute. He says, "Very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am." Notice the terrifying, deliberate destruction of grammar. He doesn't say, "Before Abraham was born, I was." That would just mean he was a really, really old angel or a pre-existent spirit. He says, "Before Abraham was born, I am." He takes the exact, sacred, eternal, unspeakable name of God from the burning bush in Exodus, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, and applies it directly to his own physical body. He is telling them, "You think I am trapped in the 1st century. You think I am bound by the clock, but I am the eternal present. I am the architect of time itself. I predate the universe, and I am standing right in front of you." The Pharisees understood exactly what he was claiming. They understood the absolute blasphemy of a human being claiming the title of the eternal God. The text says that immediately upon hearing this, they picked up massive stones from the temple floor to crush his skull and execute him on the spot. But Jesus, slipping through the angry mob, simply hid himself and walked out of the temple grounds. His time, his appointed hour on the clock, had not yet come. But his time did come, and when it came, the ultimate collision of eternity and chronological time resulted in the most brutal, agonizing event in history, the cross. If you view the crucifixion of Jesus Christ merely as a historical event that happened on a Friday afternoon in the year 33 CE outside the walls of Jerusalem, you are completely missing the mechanics of salvation. The cross is not just an event in time. The cross is the anchor point of all time. In the book of Revelation, chapter 13, the Apostle John describes Jesus with a chilling, mysterious, and profound title. He calls him the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world.
How can a man be slain from the creation of the world if the crucifixion happened thousands of years after the world was created? Because the cross is an eternal event that manifested in physical time. When Jesus hung on the rough wood of the cross, bleeding out in the dark, suffocating under the weight of his own collapsing lungs, he was not just absorbing the sins of the Roman soldiers and the Pharisees standing around him.
because he is the eternal God. The act of his sacrifice violently ripped through the fabric of the space-time continuum. The blood he shed on that Friday afternoon possessed an infinite, eternal momentum.
The shockwave of his forgiveness traveled backward through time, covering the sins of Abraham, Moses, David, and all the ancients who had died hoping for a rescue, offering burnt animals on altars that could never actually wash away guilt. And the shockwave traveled forward through time, crashing into the 21st century, covering your sins, my sins, and the sins of people who will not be born for another 1,000 years. The cross is the ultimate cosmic epicenter. It is the moment where the clock of human history was completely shattered by the heavy hammer of eternal grace. And this cosmic collision of timelines culminates in the final, terrifying, and awe-inspiring book of the Bible, the Revelation of John. But Revelation doesn't just show us the end of the world.
It shows us the brutal, final reckoning for those who managed to escape the timeline early. Earlier, we talked about Enoch and Elijah, the two men who were assumed into heaven, who completely bypassed the terrifying experience of biological death. They lived in the blinding light of paradise for thousands of years, safe from the decay and violence of the earth. But the timeline always demands its due. Death is a debt that must eventually be paid by all mortal flesh. In Revelation chapter 11, John sees a vision of the final, apocalyptic days of the earth. He sees two mysterious prophets, known as the two witnesses, appear in the streets of Jerusalem. They are granted terrifying power.
They can breathe fire from their mouths to consume their enemies. They can shut up the sky so it does not rain, and they can strike the earth with every kind of plague. For centuries, many early church fathers and theologians have identified these two witnesses as Enoch and Elijah, the only two men in human history who never died. Imagine the absolute, horrific irony of their destiny. They were taken to paradise. They were granted eternal life, bypassing the decay of the earth. They lived in the eternal present for millennia. And then, God tells them it is time to go back. They are shoved back into physical, decaying bodies.
They are placed back onto the bloody, chronological timeline in the most dangerous, war-torn city on earth during the reign of the Antichrist, simply so they can preach, be hated, and then be brutally, publicly murdered by the beast that rises from the abyss. Their corpses are left to rot in the public square for 3.5 days, while the entire world throws parties, gloats, and exchanges gifts over their dead bodies. The timeline finally reclaims its debt. Even those who bypass death were only granted a massive postponement. They resurrect, yes, and they ascend back to heaven in a cloud. But the trauma of returning to the timeline to be slaughtered is a dark, staggering reality of the biblical narrative.
But the final, ultimate revelation given to John on the island of Patmos is not about the death of prophets or the collapse of empires. It is about the death of time itself. In Revelation chapter 10, John sees a massive, terrifying, colossal angel descend from heaven. The angel is clothed in a cloud with a glowing rainbow above his head. His face shines like the sun, and his legs are like fiery pillars. He plants his right foot firmly on the roaring sea and his left foot on the solid land, claiming absolute sovereign dominion over the entire physical earth. And then the angel raises his right hand to heaven and swears a roaring oath by him who lives forever and ever, who created the heavens, the earth, and the sea. The angel declares,
But in some ancient manuscripts and translations of the Greek text, the phrase is even more blunt, terrifying, and profound. The angel literally shouts, "Time shall be no more." The end of the biblical narrative is the absolute end of the chronological prison. When the new heaven and the new earth descend from God in Revelation 21, the text explicitly, beautifully states that the sun and the moon are no longer needed. There is no night. There are no shadows. Why? Because the sun and the moon are the gears of the cosmic clock. They are the mechanisms of Chronos. They are the very things that measure the days, the months, the years, and the decay of human bodies.
In the New Jerusalem, the clock is completely dismantled. Entropy is eradicated. The city is illuminated entirely, perpetually, by the glory of God and the light of the Lamb. When you understand the biblical text through the lens of time, the entire narrative changes. The Bible is not a dry, historical record of ancient people living linear lives, waiting to die. It is a massive, sweeping, terrifyingly beautiful epic about a dimension of light trying to rescue a dimension of dust. It tells us that Chronos, the ticking clock, the gray hair, the decay of our bodies, the inevitability of death, is not the ultimate reality. The monster of time is not invincible. Time is a temporary structure, a fragile scaffolding built by God to hold the universe together, while the great, agonizing drama of redemption plays out on the stage of human history.
When Enoch vanished into the sky, he was proving that time can be bypassed. When the Watchers descended, they proved that manipulating the timeline leads to apocalyptic horror. When God amputated human lifespans to 120 years, he proved that the clock is a weapon against human tyranny. When Lot's wife was turned to salt, she proved the terror of holding on to a dying past. When the Israelites wandered for 40 years, they proved that time can be a slow, grinding executioner. When Joshua froze the sun and Hezekiah reversed the shadow, they proved that gravity and entropy are just minor suggestions to the Creator. When Jonah sat in the dark belly of the fish, he proved that God can hit pause on a human life.
When the witch dragged Samuel out of the earth, she proved that eternity is a closed door we are forbidden to force open. When the demons begged for a delay, they proved that hell is a slave to the calendar. When Moses and Elijah stood on the mountain, they were proving that the dead are not really dead. They are vibrantly, fiercely alive in the presence of God. And when the Word became flesh, when the eternal I Am stepped into the cradle, worked in the dust, and allowed himself to be nailed to the cross, he proved that God loves this broken, decaying, time-bound world so profoundly that he was willing to be crushed by the clock in order to break its power forever. The promise of the Christian faith is not that you will live for a really, really long time in the clouds.
The promise is that one day, the ticking of the clock will completely, utterly stop. The promise is that the monster that hunts us all will finally be slain. The second law of thermodynamics will be repealed. There will be no sun, no moon, no night, and no day. There will only be the blinding, endless, infinite light of the eternal present. You are currently trapped in the river of time, being carried relentlessly toward the ocean. But the God you serve is the ocean itself, and He is waiting for you. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the mysteries of eternity. Let's keep exploring the great unknowns together. Next time.